Yes, thank you for the introduction. I will be talking to you about the small town of Scunthorpe and my project around it, which will mean nothing to most of you, but to those who do know England, Scunthorpe is, I would like to say, a slight backwater, but we'll engage in that. So I'd like to talk about the project, which is funded by Historic England and partly from our government, and it's part of Historic England's wider programme of area investigating and mapping, similar to the other projects that Matt described yesterday. So Scunthorpe is a small town in what is now a local authority of North Lincolnshire in England. And North Lincolnshire is a rural agricultural landscape, but it does have sizable pockets of industrial and residential development. The area is somewhat isolated from the rest of England, with the Humber Estuary to the north, the River Trent to the west, and a very much more rural county of Lincolnshire to the south. However, North Lincolnshire and Scunthorpe in particular do enjoy international links via the seaports. There's a port here called Trent Port, and there are other ports, Immingham and Grimsby and the like, further down the coast. And its position in relation to the Humber Estuary and the importance of that and these two big rivers will become clear, with the River Trent, which comes down all the way through the Midlands to drain into the Humber Estuary in the North Sea, and the Ouse, which has lots of tributaries that fan out across from Yorkshire. So both of them have a very wide catchment area. So this is my area of survey as it was drafted in the 1820s, and this map illustrates quite nicely some of the characteristics of this area. I've shown my area in red, so it takes up most of the screen there. So moving from west to east, we have the lower reaches of the River Trent meandering here. Actually, it's flowing northwards, I should point that out at this point, but meandering through this fairly wide, broad valley, which as I said before, joins the Humber. And then in this wide valley, we have several areas of commons, which is where there would be common grazing, which is an indication of how poor it was agriculturally. And then, as the map shows, we have a steep rise up to this area here. Again, we've got lots of common ground and warrens and the like, and this is a reflection of windblown sounds and acidic soils in the area. Another step up, and then areas of woodland, and then we descend again down into what was a river, the old River Anclon, which is a kind of another meandering river, but by this time even had been straightened with this very straight navigation. And we can see water management is starting to creep in. Further over to the west, we have drainage of the Hatfield Chase, with the Dutch engineers coming over, and we can already see some drainage ditches being created here. And as you can see at this time, settlement was relatively sparse. We have very few and dispersed villages, and Scunthorpe, which I've highlighted here in red, was one of the smaller of those villages as well. It's basically a small hamlet at the crossroads. So if we contrast that with this area 2 centuries later, we can see there's been an enormous amount of change. We still have the river, obviously, meandering northwards. You can see its muddy waters here. A little bit more development and expansion of the villages. Trent Port here, which is one of those hubs for transportation. A bit more agriculture. More of this area here is under cultivation. Then, of course, is massive conurbation, urbanisation. Compare that to what Scunthorpe had been 2 centuries ago. And then we have a large industrial area still surviving here, and this is the heart of Scunthorpe Steelworks. This now light industrial distribution centre area, which was previously steelworks. And then as we move further west, to the east, very similar to what we had 2 centuries before, not so much has changed in this area. So the geology really determines this landscape, and it's complex and it changes abruptly from east to west. You can see we're only a couple of kilometres from one to the other here, and this is a very much simplified version of that landscape in geology. I'm going to be focusing on these 2 areas here today, which is the floodplain and the Ironstone Plateau. The floodplain, as I mentioned before, until the 18th century, it was a low-lying area with a mix of peaty ground, which had developed on kind of the undulating surface of windblown sands and some alluvium. And this land was difficult to farm and unproductive. But this began to change in the beginning of the 19th century as the land was improved by a process called warping. So Warping is the process of covering lands with alluvium by artificial means rather than natural river alluviation. So no doubt influenced by observations in the Nile Valley and the Indus Valley, but this is a way of doing that process artificially. It was published in agricultural journals in the 1820s, and they suggested it had actually been in use in this particular area since the middle of the 1700s. And the aim of warping was to improve soil quality by depositing rich and fertile silts and fine gravels across the land, and in doing so covering those acid peats and sands with more neutral deposits and providing a better soil structure. And the process of warping, of adding that alluvium to land, also raised the height of the land, which in turn made it easier to drain. So I've put together a quick schematic of how warping worked, and this is very much a simplification of the process, but it'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about for when I show you things later. So here we have the river. Here we have the River Trent, as I said, flowing northwards. And it has its own kind of natural embankment, its natural levees, as we'll see later. And then a warping drain was cut from the river. Sorry, wrong one again. Huge, great big drain was cut from the river inland towards the higher ground over this side, and that was to allow water from the river to move inland. And then a warping compartment, and it was protected by banks as well, sorry. And then a warping compartment, this was the kind of the target area at any one time. A large bank was constructed around that, and ditches were cut through the compartment to allow water to move across it. And all of the water was controlled by sluice gates. One on the river, one there, a more complex situation than I've shown, but it gives you an idea. Just as an indication of how poor the soil was at this time before the warping took place, where they have put boreholes through and looked at that interface between the ground surface and the earliest warp, bog cotton is quite common, so we're talking about a very wet, boggy, acidic area. So as we go on, so in normal circumstances, as I said, the River Trent is flowing that way, and we have everything set up for the first warp. The key to this process is really that massive estuary that we have to the north. At high tide, this would push very silty, mud-rich waters back down down the River Trent for quite some distance. Warping was carried out for many, many kilometres further south than this. The sluice gates would be opened, and that muddy water was then allowed in to other warping compartments, and our example here, and this would spread out across the warping compartment. And those ditches would kind of angle it around what would be an undulating surface, so that the idea was to build up a fairly level area. Eventually that would fill, and then the silts in that water would be allowed to settle out into the compartment. And then once the tide had turned and when the water was flowing again, the movement was going that way, and the silt had been allowed to settle out, those cleaner waters, which had now dropped their sediment load, would be allowed back along the warping channel by the opening of the sluice gate, and that would scour out any deposits that had been in the warping channel, and it would join the river again and continue its usual flow. And this process was repeated several times within a season, so through the spring tides. And gradually that silt would build up in the warping compartment. And if you were to put a trench across one of these compartments, you'd see it as a series of laminated deposits, quite narrow, but building up over several occasions. And eventually, once it was judged that enough warp had built up on the land, clover and oats were grown on the land just to get it to settle down. But those main kind of structural elements, the bank and the ditches within, were either infilled or the bank was removed and deliberately taken away, because that was also agriculturally productive land now. And so it did interfere with the process of farming, so they were taken away. But the main warping drains tended to remain so that they could serve other warping compartments. Contemporary accounts suggest that an area of about 1 to 2 kilometres could be warped to a satisfactory depth in about 2 to 2.5 years. So this wasn't an overnight process. It was something that was quite long and drawn out. It required a lot of input in terms of construction of the banks and the digging of the ditches. And it also meant that that land, whatever it had been useful for before, was taken out of that process for the time being as well. And eventually this became very productive for cereals and potatoes. And obviously with the proximity to the River Trent, potatoes was a suitable crop because it's a heavy crop that needs a lot to transport it. So we come to the question of what is the significance of warping. You know, it's a relatively recent activity. And its process of historical and regional interest, it doesn't appear to have been practised anywhere else in England. And that is obviously because it's very specific geographic and hydrological requirements. And it's really shaped the landscape of the lower Trent Valley. But the physical remains of the process do survive, either as integral elements of the landscape, as we shall see, or as archaeological features. But there's also the point that the warping has effectively sealed and buried old land surface and environments. And this obviously has implications for remote sensing, but also for the preservation of those old surfaces. And at this point, you're probably thinking, what does this all look like? So this is a 1940s vertical. You may just be able to pick out in this area here some of the earthworks associated with warping. It's not, I'll just zoom in slightly there. It's not common for them to be preserved in this amount of clarity and crispness. And I'm not sure whether this is because this was a failed warp or a relatively recent warp. It might have been one that was abandoned partway through for whatever reason, or maybe just that it was more recent than some of the others we see on the photographs. And this is the LiDAR, a couple of LiDAR visualizations to just show how low some of these remains are. Other features do survive better. You may be able to pick out a ditch here, but overall the LiDAR was a supplementary rather than a primary source for this. And as you might have noticed, there's very little correlation between those internal ditches and what would then become the field system, the kind of post-enclosure field system. If we look at some of the aerial photography, this shows some quite striking details, and you can see some of the complexities that I kind of skirted over in my schematic. You can see the arrangement of banks here. There's some kind of strange looping. This might be the position of a sluice gate here. We have other banks and things that would be used to funnel that water around the warping compartment to try and make sure the warp went everywhere that it was needed. Obviously, all of these survive as earthwork, as crop marks. There is something underground, but you can see this drainage ditch has actually reutilised a large warping drain. You can see where it stopped here, and you can just see the banks, but there is a drain running through that is still active. We don't have so many specialist photographs of the warping, and I think that's probably one of those historical things where it is a relatively recent process and maybe it was ignored and overlooked. But where we do have it, it has been showing us some interesting points. You can see the large banks that flanked a warping drain here, and you can see how crisply defined they are, and that's the indication of where, rather than having a bank that over time has been moved backwards and forwards by ploughing, it was literally taken away in one foul swoop. All you're seeing is the very bottom of the bank, which had to be quite firmly padded down so that it wouldn't seep water out. But we also have this rather unusual feature here. I'm not sure how clear it is to you, but basically it's a kind of alternating dark and lighter lines in this arrangement going, and it does continue along the edge of the, we're kind of on the edge of the floodplain here. The land starts to rise as we come to here. I wasn't quite sure what this represented, but one of the things that it might indicate is a slightly different system of warping. So what I've described so far has been called flood warping. It's where the river does the river and the tidal waters do the action for you. But historically, there are also accounts over on Hatfield Chase of cart warping, where they would go out and they would excavate an old river paleo channel, take the alluvium from there, and then cart it out across areas of boggy ground and stuff, almost on a little railway. And then the little railway would move as areas were filled in. So part of me is wondering whether this very marginal area, where the tidal floodwaters might not have been able to quite reach, whether cart warping was applied in this area instead. And Obviously, the nature of the warping infrastructure is such that the warp ditches aren't going to give us the kind of cultural material that we might expect from big prehistoric or medieval ditches. But the environmental conditions, that kind of dampness, and obviously their relative recency means that organic material can survive and it can be good. And this is an example from an excavation just the other side of the River Trent in advance of a wind farm construction. And it shows quite nicely the amazing preservation of the sluice in this area with all the timber boarding and lots of complex engineering in there as well. So it tells us that archaeology does have more to tell us about this process than just those old accounts in the agricultural journals. As we step out a little bit and use the LiDAR to help us understand the landscapes and the implications of warp deposits, we can see, as I showed you before, the river running northwards, its levees naturally formed. And then I should probably point out that in this, I've really exaggerated those lower layers so that we could see the very subtle differences in land level. So we have down to -1 metres below sea level in these areas here. Then the warped areas are this kind of moving from the lighter blue to the cream. These areas, which are still very low and be around below sea level, we have historical accounts of where landowners or tenants refused to warp their land. They didn't want to bear the cost of taking land out of production, of building the banks, and also sometimes they had to lease access to those big warping drains. So there was a big financial cost to it. So we can see in the LiDAR where landowners had decided not to warp their ground. We can also see some of those higher points of the wind-blown sands protruding here. So what are those implications of the warp deposits? As I've said before, they can be over 1 metre thick and it can then effectively seal and bury old land surfaces. And these might protect environmental and cultural material and waterlogged deposits. And it may also have sealed archaeological features and finds on those islands of wind-blown sands where they have been covered. And these are an important interface between the riverine wetlands and the high ground to the east. So I'm going to have a quick look at this area up here. In the LiDAR, you can see how the wind-blown sand is just poking out over the warped ground around it, which looks a lot more level. You can see how the crop has reacted to that wind-blown sand as well. And here we have a Second World War heavy anti-aircraft battery, which has just taken advantage of that slight elevated position. And we can also see those sands quite clearly in recent older photography as well. So together we have an ability to map those exposed wind-blown sands, which will also tell us where those are areas that are buried next to them as well. So I'm going to quickly move on to the completely contrasting landscape of the Ironstone Plateau, just a mere 2 or 3 kilometres to the east. So steel production began in Scunthorpe in the latter part of the 19th century, and it still continues today. The development of the industry will, of course, be well documented through various company plans and records and so forth. But there's also a really rich variety of historical and recent aerial imagery. And I'm trying to put this together to pull something which is a resource for a non-specialist audience, and in particular school children in the area, to help them understand their relatively recent industrial heritage. If we look at a historic map, this is from 1886. Ironstone was already being mined in this area. This is the workings of the rail links and so forth here, and we have a couple of test trial holes here to see the depth of the deposits. But at this point, the particular works that I'm going to look at, the Lysett steelworks, haven't yet been built. I've chosen this one because it has much better photographic coverage than the other steelworks to the south, which were operating at this time. So the Lysett steelworks were established in the early 20th century, and they had quickly expanded into the complex that we see here by the middle of that century. So we can see quite a footprint. However, it has now been almost completely dismantled, and as I said before, it's used for lighter industry and distribution warehouses and the like. And there's very little, as far as I can see, of the built heritage surviving in this area, but there may be some substantial earthworks associated with the quarrying and the later deposition of slag and the like. But for the most part, there's very little surviving. So these historic photographs provide an opportunity to demonstrate and discuss this industrial heritage. The vertical photographs are excellent. They produce provide a plan-like view in which to discuss the various processes, because this site basically did everything. It was a beginning to end process that all took place within this one complex. So let's look first at, go back. I'm going to concentrate first on this area here, which is where they're actually taking the iron ore out of the ground. In this area, the ore, as I explained on the ironstone plateau, is exposed at the surface. It's exposed at the surface, so it was relatively easy to access. Faces were cut into the ironstone, the overburden was put to one side, and the ore was trolleyed off to the works itself. This area here is, in English terms, quite a famous Iron Age and Romano-British settlement, which, as you can see, was precariously nearly destroyed by the ironstone quarrying. Back to our plan again, and I'll move on to number 2, which is this area here. I forgot to mention, these oblique photographs, which give us that nice sideways view so we can really see what's going on and what these complexes look like, are part of the Aerofilms collection, which has recently been digitised by Historic England. So these are on open access to anyone. And what I'm trying to do is to use some of those to explain the process in the hope that people will then go and look at more of them, because there are literally hundreds of this particular site. So this is the sinter plant. This is where the iron ore would be taken in. They also had to, as well as their local ores from these quarries, they had to bring in ores from further south because they had a difficult chemical composition and they were better at producing steel. So they had to blend the ores, mix them together, and then generate in a composition that was suitable to put into the blast furnaces. Moving on to the hot area, so to speak, here, the main part of the complex. We have excellent photographs that show us that all of the processes that are going on. So we have the blast furnaces here. You can maybe see these scaffolding-like ramps. This is where the ore would be taken up and then tipped in, charging the furnace to the top. We have cowper stoves behind, which are the heat-generating stoves. We have a gas holder. We have coke ovens, banks of coke ovens here, and wooden cooling towers. I had no idea about wooden cooling towers. Amazing structures built of cedar. Seem to come in kit form from a place in Bradford, which is a city not too far to the northwest. These were obviously later replaced by concrete ones, and there are photographs of them overlapping, which is quite impressive. And the melting shop, where the steel that was produced in those furnaces would then be taken in, reheated, and then either rolled out or processed in a further way so that it became the product. You can just also see in this photograph the other steelworks in the background. These are the ones that had earlier origins, and you can see there's kind of little clusters, because at this time there were a lot of different enterprises and industries, and they kind of coalesced later into what we know now as Scunthorpe Steels, Tata, but maybe someone else by tomorrow, I don't know. Obviously, we don't have any in-process photographs for the licensed steelworks, but this is one that was taken a couple of years ago by Dave McLeod of the steelworks to the south. We can see here I think they're tapping the slag here out into this area. All the furnaces were named after British queens, so we can see this is coming from Queen Anne. And I'm going to end quickly on the slag heap, which is this area here. This is quite interesting. The slag heap very quickly covered up this moated site, this medieval moated site. It was under here somewhere. And then when they re-landscaped the whole works, they decided to take that overburden off and to re-excavate the moat. So now, magically, we can see it as an earthwork in the LiDAR. It also was encroaching on the site of All Saints Church and Graveyard, and also the site of an Anglo-Saxon settlement, which, when it was excavated, revealed over 40 buildings. And ironically, it wasn't actually the encroachment of the slag that prompted this excavation. It was sand extraction. So, because we're on the very edge here we're in the windblown sands. And then I'll just end by taking you to this little point here on the edge of the slag heap at Scunthorpe. This again is one of these aerofilm photographs, and most of them are kind of like, look at the company, look at the layout and everything. And I love this one because it's just a little point in time where the little steam engine has pulled along the tipper wagons from the steelworks with the slag in it. I think those have still got their slag in. This one's just tipped out. It's almost like popping an ice cube out of a tray. We can see the shape of the tipped waste here and some of the others. I'm assuming they had to work at night because on the top of the slag heap, this is all slag, all of this, on the top of the slag heap, we've got a little row of with lamps and also a telegraph wire. So I imagine they were working through the cold winter nights in Scunthorpe. And just looking in detail at the little steam engine, we can see the tipper wagons, the one with the slag in still, the one that's just tipped. And there's a chap there, and he's looking up at the camera. Because I'd imagine at that time in the 1950s, it wasn't that often that an aeroplane would come over you and take a photograph at a relatively low altitude. But I bet he didn't think that we'd be standing here today looking back down at him. Thank you.